Jake's neighbors wanted to kick him off his family ranch. They said his farm didn't belong in their fancy neighborhood. But they made one big mistake. They didn't know Jake owned the building where they held all their meetings. Now it was time to teach them a lesson. Before watching full story, comment below from where you watching. Also like and subscribe for more stories. The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, and I knew it was bad news before I even opened it. My name is Jake, and I own a small ranch on the outskirts of Millbrook County. What most people don't know is that my property sits right in the middle of what became the fancy Willowbrook Heights subdivision 5 years ago. When developers bought all the land around me, I refused to sell. My grandfather built this ranch in 1952, and I wasn't about to let some city slickers turn it into another cookie-cutter neighborhood. So they built around me, creating their perfect little community with my eyesore ranch smack in the center. The letter was from the Willowbrook Heights Homeowners Association, demanding I attend an emergency meeting. The reason? Multiple violations of community standards that I never agreed to follow. I drove my beat-up pickup truck to the community center that evening, boots muddy from checking on my cattle. The meeting room was packed with residents in their pressed khakis and polo shirts, all staring at me like I was some kind of criminal. HOA President Margaret Whitfield stood at the front, her silver hair pulled back in a tight bun. She'd been leading the charge against me since day one. Next to her sat the Vice President, Bob Chin, a retired lawyer who loved flexing his legal knowledge, and Treasurer Susan Martinez, who counted every penny like it was her own money. Mr. Henderson, Margaret began, her voice dripping with fake politeness, we've called this meeting because your property continues to violate our community standards. I crossed my arms. Lady, I was here first. I never signed any of your fancy agreements. Bob Chin leaned forward. Actually, Mr. Henderson, when the county rezoned this area for residential development, certain regulations automatically applied to all properties within the boundaries. That's lawyer talk for nonsense, I shot back. Margaret pulled out a thick folder. We have documented violations dating back 18 months. Your fence doesn't meet height requirements. Your barn is the wrong color. You have commercial livestock on residential property. Your truck is parked in your driveway overnight, violating our no commercial vehicle rule. The room murmured in agreement. These people actually cared about what color my barn was. Furthermore, she continued, the smell from your cattle is affecting property values. We've received complaints about noise from your rooster at dawn. Your property is bringing down the entire neighborhood. I stood up slowly. This was a working ranch before any of you moved here. You knew what you were buying next to. Times change, Mr. Henderson, Bob said smugly. We have legal precedent to force compliance or seek removal of non-conforming properties. That's when Margaret dropped the bomb. We're prepared to file a lawsuit for immediate eviction if you don't comply with all regulations within 30 days. We've consulted with county officials, and they agree your operation is no longer suitable for this residential area. The room erupted in applause. These people were actually clapping about potentially destroying my family's legacy. I walked out without another word, but my mind was already working. They thought they could push around some dumb rancher, but they had no idea who they were messing with. See, what the HOA didn't know was that I owned more than just my ranch. When my grandfather died, he left me several properties around the county, including the land their precious community center sat on. I'd been quietly collecting rent checks from the HOA for 5 years, but they only dealt with my property management company. They had no idea their biggest enemy was also their landlord. The next morning I called my lawyer, Tom Rodriguez. Tom had been handling my family's affairs for 20 years and knew every inch of my grandfather's old property deals. Tom, I need to know exactly what rights I have as the landlord of the Willowbrook Heights Community Center. Well, Jake, you own that land outright. The HOA has a standard commercial lease with annual renewal. Why? They're trying to evict me from my ranch. Time to remind them who really runs things around here. Tom chuckled. What do you have in mind? First, I want to double their rent. What's the maximum increase allowed under their lease? Let me check. Their lease allows for rent increases up to 100% with 90 days notice, provided certain conditions are met. Market rate justification, property improvements, things like that. Perfect. And what about parking? Do they have guaranteed access to the lot behind the building? Actually, no. That's a separate agreement that expires next month. You could choose not to renew it. I smiled for the first time since receiving that letter. Draft the notices, Tom. It's time these folks learned about property rights. 1 week later, the HOA received 2 certified letters. The first informed them that their community center rent would double from $2,000 to $4,000 per month, effective immediately. The second notice terminated their parking lot agreement, giving them 30 days to find alternative arrangements. My phone started ringing within hours. Mr. Henderson, this is Margaret Whitfield. We need to discuss these outrageous rent increases immediately. Nothing outrageous about it, Margaret. Market rates have gone up significantly. You folks are always talking about property values. This is clearly retaliation for our legitimate complaints about your property. This is business. Just like your lawsuit threat was business. I hung up and went back to feeding my cattle. The HOA called an emergency meeting for that Saturday. I wasn't invited, but I drove by the community center anyway. Cars were parked 3 blocks away because they no longer had access to their usual lot. Residents were walking long distances in their dress shoes, many looking frustrated and confused. Margaret had called another meeting for the following Tuesday, this time including me. I showed up in my cleanest flannel shirt and newest jeans, which still looked pretty rough compared to their country club attire. Mr. Henderson, Bob Chin began, these rental increases are clearly punitive and potentially illegal. Actually, Bob, since you love throwing around legal terms, let me share something interesting I learned. I pulled out a folder Tom had prepared. Texas Property Code Section 93.002 states that landlords can increase rent for commercial properties based on market conditions, property improvements, or increased operational costs. I watched his confident expression falter. I've made significant improvements to the property. New security lighting, landscaping maintenance, and regular pest control. The market rate for similar community facilities in this area has increased 120% over the past 3 years. My increase is actually quite reasonable. Susan Martinez, the treasurer, looked pale. We can't afford $4,000 a month. Our budget was calculated based on the previous rate. Maybe you should have thought about that before threatening to destroy my family's ranch, I replied calmly. Margaret tried a different approach. Surely we can work something out. What if we withdrew our complaints about your property? Too late for that. You've already filed formal violations with the county. Can't unring that bell. The meeting grew heated. Residents started arguing among themselves about the budget shortfall. Some blamed the HOA board for picking a fight they couldn't win. Others insisted they should find a cheaper venue. There is no cheaper venue, Margaret snapped. This is the only community center within 10 miles that can accommodate our meetings and events. That's when I dropped the second bomb. Actually, folks, there's something else you should know. The parking lot behind this building? That's also mine. Your lease on that space expires in 3 weeks, and I've decided not to renew it. The room went silent. Where are we supposed to park? Someone called out. Not my problem. Maybe you can use the street like everyone else. Bob Chin was frantically taking notes. This has to be illegal. Landlord retaliation is a serious offense. Feel free to sue me, Bob. I'm sure Tom Rodriguez would love to handle that case for me. By the way, Tom says hello. You two went to law school together, didn't you? Bob's face went red. Tom Rodriguez was the most respected property attorney in 3 counties, and Bob knew he was outgunned. Over the next month, the situation got increasingly chaotic. The HOA couldn't afford the doubled rent without imposing special assessments on all homeowners. Residents started receiving bills for an extra $200 per month just to keep their community center. Meanwhile, without the parking lot, their meetings became logistical nightmares. People parked wherever they could find space, often blocks away. The city started issuing tickets for cars parked illegally on nearby streets. Several elderly residents stopped attending meetings because they couldn't walk the long distances. Margaret tried everything. She offered to settle the dispute, promising to drop all complaints about my ranch. She suggested mediation. She even hinted at a public apology. But I wasn't interested in half measures anymore. You see, Margaret, I told her during one phone call, you made this personal when you tried to evict me from my family's land. Now you get to learn what it feels like to lose something important to you. The breaking point came during their monthly meeting in month 2. Only about half the usual residents showed up, mostly because of the parking situation. Margaret stood before the frustrated crowd, trying to maintain order while people complained loudly about the special assessments and inconvenience. This is ridiculous, shouted Dave Morrison, a retiree who lived near my ranch. We're paying double for a meeting place we can barely access, all because the board decided to pick a fight with our neighbor. Mr. Morrison, Margaret replied stiffly, we were protecting property values for the entire community. What property values? Dave shot back. Half the people looking at houses in this neighborhood turn around and leave when they see we're in some kind of war with the guy in the middle. We look like a bunch of petty troublemakers. Other residents started voicing similar concerns. The HOA's legal bills were mounting as they tried to find ways to force me to lower the rent. Their lawyer fees alone were costing more than the original rent increase. Susan Martinez stood up with a stack of papers. I need to address our financial situation. Between the increased rent, legal fees, and decreased participation in community events, we're facing a budget crisis. We'll need to increase the special assessment to $300 per month just to break even. The room erupted. People started shouting about fiscal responsibility and demanding the board's resignation. Several families announced they were putting their houses up for sale rather than deal with the ongoing drama. That's when Margaret made her final mistake. If you all would just support us in forcing that rancher to comply with community standards, none of this would be necessary. Dave Morrison stood up again. Lady, that rancher was here first. We moved into his neighborhood, not the other way around. Maybe instead of trying to force him out, we should have tried being good neighbors. The crowd murmured in agreement. The tide was turning. After the meeting dissolved into chaos, I got a call from Dave Morrison himself. He asked if he could come talk to me privately. We sat on my front porch the next evening, watching the sunset over my pasture. Jake, he said, I want to apologize for this whole mess. Most of us had no idea the board was planning to try to evict you. We just got caught up in their rhetoric about property values. I nodded. I appreciate that, Dave. But the damage is done. Your HOA tried to destroy my family's legacy. I understand your anger. But is there any way to end this before it destroys the whole neighborhood? I was quiet for a long moment, watching my cattle graze peacefully in the distance. Tell you what, Dave. I'm not unreasonable. But if this community wants peace, it's going to cost them. What do you mean? First, the HOA board that started this war needs to resign. All of them. Second, the community needs to sign a legally binding agreement that my ranch will never be subject to HOA rules or complaints. Third, they need to publicly apologize for their actions. Dave nodded slowly. And if they do all that? I'll consider returning their rent to the original rate and renewing their parking agreement. Dave shook my hand. I'll talk to the neighbors. Give me a week. Word spread quickly through the subdivision. Within days, there was a petition circulating demanding the resignation of Margaret, Bob, and Susan. Property owners who had been silent during the conflict suddenly found their voices, expressing frustration with the board's handling of the situation. The final blow came when the local newspaper picked up the story. The headline read, HOA Board's Vendetta Against Local Rancher Backfires Spectacularly. The article detailed how the board's attempt to force out a longtime resident had resulted in financial chaos and community division. Margaret tried to weather the storm, but when 80% of homeowners signed the resignation petition, even she couldn't ignore the writing on the wall. The emergency meeting to accept the board's resignation was held in my community center, with residents parking blocks away one final time. Margaret, Bob, and Susan stood before the crowd they had led into disaster. While we maintained that our actions were legally justified, Margaret read from a prepared statement, we recognize that our approach may have been overly aggressive. In the interest of community harmony, we are stepping down from our positions. The new interim board, led by Dave Morrison, wasted no time reaching out to me. They drafted a formal apology, acknowledging that the previous board had overstepped their authority and promising that my ranch would never again be subject to HOA interference. They also agreed to a permanent easement protecting my property rights, legally preventing any future boards from repeating Margaret's mistakes. In return, I restored their rent to the original $2,000 per month and renewed their parking lot lease. But I included one special clause. A memorial plaque would be installed at the community center, dedicated to my grandfather and recognizing the ranch as the original foundation of the area. 6 months later, I was invited to the community center's rededication ceremony. The plaque read, in memory of Samuel Henderson, who established this land as a working ranch in 1952, and in recognition that growth and tradition can coexist with mutual respect. Dave Morrison gave a speech about learning to be good neighbors and respecting the history of their community. Several residents came up to me afterward, apologizing for the conflict and asking about the ranch's history. Margaret Whitfield moved away 3 months later, unable to face the neighbors who blamed her for the expensive debacle. Bob Chin retired from all community involvement, and Susan Martinez took a treasurer position with a different HOA in another town. As for me, I still wake up every morning to my roosters crow, tend to my cattle and drive my beat-up pickup truck. The difference is that now my neighbors wave when they see me instead of glaring. Some even stop by to buy fresh eggs or ask advice about their gardens. The HOA learned that trying to push around someone without knowing who you're dealing with can be an expensive mistake. They thought they were fighting a simple rancher, but they ended up in a war with their own landlord. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even. It's showing people exactly how much power they never realized you had, and then being gracious enough to use it wisely. My ranch is still here, still working, still family owned. And it always will be.